The translator finished its cycle, and Ambassador Veth Sarai of the Conclave watched the small human woman read the document a second time. Then a third. She did not speak. She did not gesture toward her delegation. She simply stood at the curved edge of the presentation dais, holding the datapad at her side, and stared at something on the far wall of the chamber that was not a wall at all. It was a viewport, and beyond it, the slow blue-white curvature of Earth filled the lower quarter of the glass like something that had forgotten it was supposed to be small. Veth Sarai had conducted 14 disarmament proceedings across 11 galactic jurisdictions. He knew what fear looked like in a species being asked to surrender its weapons. He knew compliance and he knew resistance and he knew the performative version of both. What he did not know, had never encountered, was whatever was happening in the expression of this particular human. She was smiling, not widely, not triumphantly. It was the kind of smile a person wears when they hear a joke they have already heard before, when they already know the punchline, when they are waiting politely for the other party to finish speaking before they decide what to say next. Ambassador Davina Marsh set the datapad down on the railing, smoothed the front of her jacket, and said, quietly, "We'll need 48 hours." Veth Sarai recorded the exchange as a preliminary agreement. That recording would later be reviewed by 17 separate intelligence bodies across 4 empires, each of whom would focus on different details, and not one of whom would notice that she had not, at any point, said yes. The 48 hours passed. Earth submitted its inventory. The document was, by every measurable standard, the most thorough disarmament declaration in galactic history. It was also, as the Conclave's verification teams would spend the next 3 months slowly realizing, completely accurate, not falsified, not redacted, not strategically incomplete in the ways that every species' disarmament submissions were strategically incomplete, because every species that had ever submitted disarmament documents had universally hidden something: a reserve fleet, a prototype program, a distributed weapons cache in some outer system that the verification teams would eventually find but diplomatically agree not to find. Earth hid nothing. This was the first thing that should have alarmed them. Instead, it impressed them. Veth Sarai filed a commendation internally. The Conclave's political architecture had spent 2 decades slowly tightening its disarmament requirements, culminating in the 11th Covenant, which demanded that humanity surrender its conventional weapons systems, its orbital defense platforms, its atmospheric warheads, its marine arsenal, and the clause that had caused 14 months of negotiation with every other species, its strategic reserves. Earth had signed the 11th Covenant, and Earth had delivered. What the Conclave did not know, could not have known, because it did not know the right questions to ask, was that Davina Marsh had spent the 48 hours after that presentation making a series of calls that were not logged through any diplomatic channel. She had called manufacturing facilities. She had called 12 specific universities. She had called a retired general named Akafar who had not held active rank in 11 years, and that conversation had lasted 4 minutes and contained almost no words that would have flagged any monitoring system, because the monitoring systems were listening for words, and the conversation had been conducted almost entirely in implication and silence. And then she had gone back to the conclave chamber and submitted Earth's weapons. The weapons were real. The inventory was accurate. And something else was already moving. Davina was not supposed to be the one who stayed. That was the detail that her aide, a young man named Prashan who had been with the diplomatic corps for less than 2 years, couldn't quite calibrate around during the first weeks of the occupation period. Because that was what they called it internally, though never in official communications, the occupation period, the window during which the Conclave's verification teams were physically present on Earth, cataloging everything, cross-referencing the inventory, conducting what Veth Sarai described publicly as collaborative transition oversight, and what everyone on Earth simply called the Count. Prashan understood his role. He understood Davina's role. What he did not understand was why she seemed, in some fundamental way he could not articulate, less stressed than she had been before the disarmament. He mentioned this once, carefully. Late at night in the small office they had been allocated in the temporary conclave facility outside Geneva, when the building had gone quiet and the two of them were the only humans left in the wing. Davina looked up from her screen. She considered him for a moment. "Prashant," she said, "do you know what the hardest part of this job has been?" He waited. "Not the negotiating," she said. "Not the covenant clauses, not the verification schedules, not the 18 months of Veth Sarai acting like we were a problem to be solved." She paused. "The hardest part has been making sure the right people did not speak to each other too obviously for too long before we finished the inventory." Prashant stared at her. She went back to her screen. "Get some sleep," she said. He did not sleep for a very long time after that. The first empire to notice something was wrong was not one of the conclave's primary members. It was a mid-tier commercial federation called the Theresi Compact, and what they noticed was not dramatic. It was statistical. Their economic modeling division, an unglamorous department staffed mostly by analysts who had never held political appointments and whose reports were rarely read above a certain clearance level, flagged a pattern in Earth's post-disarmament trade data. Humanity, stripped of its weapons, had immediately and dramatically increased its import of certain categories of industrial material. Not weapons, not anything on the restricted materials list, nothing that any treaty clause covered. Just materials, raw processing equipment, high-volume fabrication components. The kinds of things that in isolation meant nothing and in aggregate suggested that something was being built at a scale that the modeling division found difficult to attribute to any obvious civilian purpose. The analyst who wrote the report was named Hesse Dune. She was young, thorough, and had recently won an internal commendation for a paper on pre-conflict economic signatures in primitive species development arcs. She read her own report twice, revised her confidence interval upward, and submitted it to her supervisor. Her supervisor read the first 2 paragraphs, noted that Earth had just completed the most thorough and cooperative disarmament in recorded galactic history, and filed the report in a category that translated roughly as interesting but not actionable. Hesse Dune made a copy of the report and kept it. She would retrieve it later, 11 months later, in circumstances she could not yet imagine, and when she did, she would understand that the only thing more dangerous than a wrong answer is a correct answer that arrives too early for anyone to believe it. Davina Marsh's hands shook for the first time 6 months into the occupation period. Not from fear. She sat alone in the early morning, holding a message from her daughter that contained a video she had watched 4 times. Her daughter was 7 years old. In the video, she was explaining something about a drawing she had made, a drawing of the Earth with the conclave ships above it that she described in the casual, matter-of-fact language of a child who had never known a world without them overhead. She explained that the big ships were there to keep everyone safe. Davina watched the video a 5th time. She set her comm device face down on the desk. She sat very still for a while. Then she opened a secure channel and requested a status update from a man she had not spoken to in 4 months, a man whose name did not appear on any diplomatic roster, who worked in a facility that had never appeared in the disarmament inventory, not because it had been hidden but because it was not technically a weapons facility. The update came back in 3 words: on schedule, continue. Her hands steadied. She picked up the comm device and watched the video one more time. This time she did not look at her daughter. She looked at the drawing. The drawing was detailed. Her daughter had drawn the conclave ships very carefully, which meant she had looked at them carefully, which meant she understood their shapes, their configurations, their relative sizes. She had also drawn them at a very specific angle, the angle you would use if you were trying to show their blind spots. Davina's daughter was 7 years old. She had learned this from her mother, who had shown her, one evening months ago, what the ships looked like when you stood in certain places and looked up, and who had said, in the tone of voice parents use when they are teaching children something real, "Look carefully, because everything has a place where it can't see you." The child had simply thought it was a lesson about drawing. The collapse of the First Empire began quietly, the way all real collapses begin. The Varentha's hegemony had been the loudest proponent of the 11th Covenant. Its High Arbiter had stood at the conclave podium 15 months earlier and delivered the address that had cemented the political will for Earth's disarmament, arguing with evident satisfaction that the galaxy's most volatile species had finally been brought within the managed order. The address had been widely celebrated. The High Arbiter had received 3 separate diplomatic commendations. 8 months after Earth's disarmament, the hegemony's outer colony network began experiencing communication disruptions. Not attacks, not sabotage, disruptions. The kind that suggested infrastructure strain, resource misallocation, systems operating at margins they had not been designed to hold. The hegemony's internal analysts attributed it to a maintenance backlog, the kind of systemic rot that builds over decades in any large bureaucratic organism and tends to become visible at inconvenient moments. The Conclave's verification team on Earth, led by a senior observer named Kreth Valamir, noted the hegemony's difficulties and made no connection to anything happening below him. He was focused on Earth. Earth was cooperating fully. Earth was, by every observable metric, exactly what a properly disarmed, properly managed species should look like. Slightly reduced in economic output, slightly increased in domestic manufacturing investment, which the import data suggested, though the fabrication purpose remained unclear, and conducting itself with the careful, compliant energy of a civilization that understood its new position. He found this satisfying. He did not find it suspicious, which was an error that would be studied extensively later. Hesse Dune's second report reached her supervisor 7 months after the first. This one was harder to dismiss. The pattern she had identified in Earth's import data had expanded. The fabrication materials were being distributed, not concentrated in one region or facility, but spread across multiple continents in quantities and configurations that her modeling algorithms could not match to any civilian production profile. They were also being absorbed extremely quickly, with almost no secondary market trace, which meant they were being used rather than stockpiled, which meant something was already being produced. She had also, working carefully through publicly available corporate registration data, identified 17 new companies that had been incorporated in the months following the disarmament, all of which were legally classified as civilian research or manufacturing entities, none of which had any online presence, public contracts, or revenue streams that she could trace. She had also found something that she almost didn't include in the report because it seemed too small: a shipping record, incorrectly filed through a civilian port authority system, for a cargo described as laboratory furniture that weighed 47 tons and was listed with a delivery address that resolved to a location in northern Canada that satellite imagery showed as empty terrain. Her supervisor read the full report this time. He forwarded it to his director with a cover note that said, "I don't know what this means, but I think someone should." Davina received the news about the hegemony in the same briefing where she received the news that the conclave had begun a secondary review of Earth's trade data. She read both items in the same document in the same sitting, with the same expression she had worn when she'd first read the 11th Covenant. Prashant was across the table. He watched her eyes move between the 2 items. "They're going to connect them," he said. "Probably," she said. When they do, what they connect will be real," she said. "That's the important thing. Everything they find will be exactly what it looks like." She looked up. "That's always been the important thing." Prashant sat with this for a moment. He had, in the months since their late-night conversation, developed a new and slightly vertiginous relationship with the way Davina spoke, in which he had learned that when she said something simple, the simplicity was not an accident. "Everything they find," he said slowly, "will be exactly what it looks like." "Yes. What does it look like?" She considered him. For a moment, something crossed her face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief. It was the expression of a person carrying something they cannot put down and have stopped expecting to. "Like a species that gave up its weapons," she said, and found other things to do with its hands. The second empire to show signs of structural failure was the Thuresi Compact. This was alarming for two reasons. First, because the compact had not been a proponent of the 11th Covenant. It had been neutral content to observe, with no particular political stake in the disarmament. Second, because HFY Dune worked for the compact, and when her third report landed, this one containing a connection she had made that she almost couldn't believe herself, her director did not file it. He escalated it immediately. The connection was this. The materials Earth was importing and manufacturing at high volume, distributed across 17 unidentified corporate entities, clustered in configurations that matched no weapons profile. They matched an infrastructure profile. Specifically, they matched the profile of large-scale distributed network construction, communications infrastructure, power relay systems, processing architecture of the kind you would need if you were building something that needed to operate independently, without external support, across a very large physical footprint, simultaneously with no single point of failure. Not weapons, not military, infrastructure, planetary infrastructure, at a scale that, if her calculations were correct, would take approximately 3 to 4 years to complete. The Conclave's verification teams had been watching Earth for weapons. They had been watching for the wrong category of threat. They had been watching a species hand over the tools it used to fight, without once asking why that species seemed completely unconcerned about what would happen next. HFY Dune filed her report and sat back in her chair and thought about a detail she had not included, because she could not figure out how to articulate why it mattered. Every human she had ever observed in any diplomatic or commercial context had, eventually at some point, mentioned something about the long term, about decades, about what things would look like in 50 years, 100 years. They said it casually, the way you mention tomorrow's weather, as if it were simply a normal temporal horizon. Most species thought in election cycles, or administrative periods, or the lifespans of ruling bodies. Humans thought in generations. She had not included this in the report because she wasn't sure it was relevant. She was beginning to think it was the only thing that was relevant. Veth Sarai was recalled to the Conclave's central administrative hub 9 months into the occupation period. He left with confidence. Earth was compliant. The verification was proceeding smoothly. He was being recalled because the Varentha's hegemony's destabilization was consuming political attention, and his experience was needed in deliberative chambers, not in an Earth-side observation role. Before he left, he met with Davina Marsh for a final briefing. He later described this meeting in his memoir, a document that would be published much later, after many things had changed, as one of the most unsettling conversations of his diplomatic career, despite the fact that nothing had been said that he could identify as alarming. She had asked him 3 questions. First, how long did the Conclave expect the hegemony's stabilization to require? Second, was the Compact's internal restructuring affecting the Conclave's outer verification resources? Third, what was the Conclave's current assessment of the Jeth Varon Collective's political alignment? He had answered all 3 questions straightforwardly because they were straightforward questions, and she was the Earth ambassador, and the Conclave's policy was cooperative transparency during the disarmament period. It was only later, much later, that he reread his own answers and understood what she had been calculating. Because the 3 questions, taken together, mapped precisely onto the 3 primary resource commitments of the 3 largest conclave powers. She had not asked anything he had not publicly said before. She had asked it in an order, and a combination, that told her something his individual answers had not. She had known exactly which questions to ask to find out how thin the conclave was stretched. And she had asked them while smiling at him the same way she had smiled when she first read the 11th Covenant. The facility in northern Canada was not empty terrain. The satellite imagery was accurate. There was nothing on the surface. What the Conclave's verification teams had not done, because they had no reason to, because they were looking at an inventory that had been certified complete, because Earth was cooperating, because the very thoroughness of the cooperation had become its own kind of camouflage, was look at what was below it. General HFY, retired, unranked, technically a civilian, stood in a chamber that had been carved out of the bedrock over the preceding 14 months and looked at what Davina's 48-hour delay had made possible. It was not a weapons facility. There was not a single weapon in the building. The inventory would have been accurate even if they had found this place, which they hadn't, but even if they had, there was nothing here that violated the 11th Covenant, or any covenant, because this was not a weapons facility. It was a communications relay hub. One of many, hundreds actually, distributed globally, each one embedded in locations that the verification teams had passed over because they were looking for what they expected to find. It was the kind of infrastructure you would need if you wanted to coordinate something complex across an entire planet, without depending on any communications architecture that an external power could observe, intercept, or disrupt. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of infrastructure a species would build if it had spent several decades watching empires collapse and had developed over those decades a very specific theory about why empires collapse and what you needed to survive when they did. HFY was not a theorist. He was a practical man. He walked through the facility and checked the systems because that was his job, and then he stepped outside into the cold Canadian morning and looked up at the sky, where the nearest conclave verification ship was orbiting in its designated pattern, and he thought about a conversation he had had with Davina 11 months ago, in which she had said something he kept returning to. She had said, "They're going to think we're afraid of them." He had said, "We're not." And she had said, in a tone he still couldn't fully categorize, "We're afraid of what happens after them. That's a different fear, and it's the more important one to plan for." The Varenthes hegemony's outer colony network collapsed 14 months after Earth's disarmament, not from attack, not from revolution. From the accumulated weight of 1,000 administrative decisions that had each seemed reasonable in isolation and were catastrophic in combination. The kind of systemic failure that emerges when a large organization optimizes for political stability over structural integrity, over a very long period, until the structure can no longer hold its own weight. 3 weeks later, the Thuresi Compact's Central Governing Council entered emergency session. The Jeth Varon Collective, which had been the third piece of Davina's 3-question calculation, began quiet repatriation of assets from its outer trade networks. And the Conclave, which had spent 14 months focused on the unprecedented task of managing Earth's disarmament, pouring resources and political attention and verification infrastructure into ensuring that the galaxy's most unpredictable species had been properly contained, found itself suddenly, simultaneously, facing structural emergencies on 3 separate fronts, in 3 separate member territories, with a verification team on Earth that was suddenly, urgently, needed elsewhere. Veth Sarai stood in the Conclave's deliberative chamber and watched the 3 crises appear on the tactical display in overlapping columns of data, and he felt, for the first time in his career, a specific kind of dread, not the dread of a threat you can see, but the dread of a pattern you have just recognized, just barely too late, as a pattern. He turned to the chamber's intelligence liaison and asked a question he should have asked a year ago. What is Earth doing right now? What Earth was doing right now was exactly what it had been doing for the past 14 months. Working. The phrase productive compliance had been used in 3 separate conclave assessments of Earth's post-disarmament behavior. It was accurate. Humanity had been extraordinarily, almost ostentatiously productive since handing over its weapons, economically active, internally cohesive, surprisingly unconcerned with the political turmoil developing in the galactic community around it. The conclave analysts had noted this and described it, in that confident, incurious way of bureaucracies that have already reached their conclusions, as evidence that the disarmament had produced the intended normalization effect. The conclave's verification team on Earth, now reduced by 2/3 as resources were redirected to the emerging crises, continued its regular reporting schedule. Kreth Valamir, the senior observer, filed his standard assessment on the morning of the hegemony's collapse announcement. He described Earth as stable, compliant, and unremarkable. That evening, he attended a dinner hosted by the Swiss canton hosting the conclave facility, organized by the local government as a routine diplomatic goodwill gesture. The food was excellent. The humans were warm, slightly formal, and very interested in his work. A woman seated across from him asked thoughtful questions about galactic governance that suggested she had done substantial reading on the subject. He answered them. He enjoyed the conversation. He did not realize, until much later, that she was one of the 17 company directors whose entities had appeared in Hesse Dune's reports, that her questions had been specifically constructed to confirm information she needed rather than discover information she lacked, and that she had arrived at dinner already knowing the answers and was simply verifying them. He filed no report about the dinner because it was a social engagement. This was standard practice. Nobody had told him to report social engagements, because nobody had imagined that a disarmed species would conduct meaningful intelligence operations through dinner conversation. Davina was in the northern Canadian facility when the conclave's formal request arrived. The request was unprecedented. In 40 years of galactic governance, no institution had ever asked a disarmed species to rearm. The language was careful: a provisional security partnership, a cooperative stabilization arrangement, a temporary augmentation of regional protective capacity. But underneath the language was the structure. 3 empires were in various stages of collapse. A dozen smaller political bodies were repositioning in ways that suggested the collapses would propagate. And the conclave, which had spent 14 months dismantling Earth's military capacity, was now asking if Earth could help stabilize the resulting disorder. She read the request once. Then she read the section about the proposed timeline. Then she set the document down and looked at Akafar, who was standing across a worktable from her in the clean artificial light of the underground facility, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "They want the weapons back in operational configuration within 6 months," she said. "I saw. They want joint command authority over deployment decisions. I saw. They want it in exchange for a renegotiated covenant that maintains most of the core disarmament provisions." She paused. "They think we've been sitting here waiting." Akafar said nothing. The facility hummed around them, its systems running quietly, doing exactly what they had been designed to do. "Davina," he said eventually, "what do you want to tell them?" She thought about her daughter's drawing. She thought about the video. She thought about the long term and what things looked like in decades, and what a species does when it finally understands that the structure it has been living inside is not as permanent as it appeared. "Tell them," she said carefully, "that Earth appreciates the conclave's confidence. Tell them we're happy to discuss a partnership arrangement. Tell them we'll need 48 hours. Akafar looked at her. 48 hours. Yes, he understood. He had been present by proxy for the first 48 hours. He knew what that number meant when she used it. "And during those 48 hours?" he asked. She picked up a different document, a status report she had been reviewing before the conclave's message arrived, detailing the current completion percentage of the distributed infrastructure network, the operational readiness of the communications relay system, and the activation protocols for a set of frameworks that had been built on the assumption that this moment would eventually arrive. "During those 48 hours," she said, "we finish." The conclave's intelligence division released its internal assessment of the Earth situation 3 weeks after the rearmament request, in a document that was classified at the highest level, and that would not become public for many years. The assessment ran to 400 pages. Its conclusions were organized, technically precise, and collectively amounted to one of the most comprehensive admissions of institutional error in galactic administrative history. The document concluded that Earth had not at any point deceived the conclave. Every inventory item had been accurate. Every treaty clause had been honored. Every verification process had been completed in full compliance. There had been no hidden weapons, no concealed military programs, no falsified data. What had happened? And the assessment circled this conclusion for nearly 100 pages before landing on it, was that the conclave had asked the wrong questions. It had optimized its verification protocols for the kinds of deception that other species engaged in, and had built its monitoring systems to detect the kinds of threats that other species posed, and had conceptualized Earth's compliance in the terms that it was familiar with. It had asked, "Where are the weapons?" It had not asked, "What are they building instead?" It had asked, "Is Earth afraid?" It had not asked, "What are they afraid of?" It had monitored Earth's military capacity and concluded that a species without weapons was contained. It had not considered that a species willing to voluntarily give up its weapons, completely, transparently, without a single hidden reserve, was a species that had already decided it didn't need them anymore. For now, because it was building something that weapons could not build, that no one had thought to prohibit, and that would outlast every empire that had stood over it for the past 14 months with its hand extended, demanding compliance, receiving it, and believing that compliance was the same as submission. The assessment's final section, marked with a classification designation that indicated it was intended for senior leadership only, contained a single paragraph that had been added by the division director, and that was not part of the formal analytical framework. It read, "The human representative's initial response to the 11th Covenant, her smile, and her request for 48 hours, which was noted in Ambassador Veth Sarai's contemporaneous report as a positive indicator of compliance, should be re-examined. We have been unable to identify any record of what she did during those 48 hours that would constitute a treaty violation. We have also been unable to account for her apparent certainty, in that moment, before a single action had been taken, that the outcome was already determined. We recommend further study of human long-range planning behavior, with particular attention to the possibility that the 48-hour period represents not a decision point, but a notification. The moment a human diplomat informs you of something that has already been set in motion." Hesse Dune's fourth report was the shortest. It contained one observation, 3 lines long. Earth's distributed infrastructure network had reached full operational capacity. It was not connected to any external system. It did not need to be. Davina Marsh stood at the viewport of a different room, in a different facility, in a city that had been her home before she had spent the better part of 2 years living in borrowed offices and diplomatic quarters. Through the glass, she could see the city in the early evening, its lights beginning to appear against the darkening sky in that particular pattern she had memorized long before she had memorized anything about galactic politics. Her daughter was somewhere in that city. She would see her tomorrow. Prashant stood behind her because he was always somewhere nearby now, had been since the night she had told him to get some sleep and he had not, the night she had said something simple that had taken him months to fully unfold. "They're going to ask," he said, "for a long time what we were planning. Probably. What do we tell them?" She thought about this with genuine care. It was a real question and it deserved a real answer. "Tell them," she said, "that we weren't planning for any particular outcome. We were planning for any outcome." She watched a light come on in a window across the city. "Empires plan for the futures they expect. We've had enough history to know that the future you expect is usually not the one that arrives." A pause. "So we built for the one that does, whatever it is." Prashant stood with this. Outside, the city continued its evening in its ordinary way, its lights and its sounds and its million small human operations, cooking and arguing and putting children to bed, all of it running on the infrastructure beneath it, invisible and complete, not connected to any power that could reach down and turn it off. "Was it worth it?" he asked. It was not a diplomatic question. It was a genuine one. She turned from the viewport. Her face, in the room's low light, was tired in the specific way of someone who has held something very heavy for a very long time and has only just set it down. "Ask me in 20 years," she said. "That's the only timeline that matters." She picked up her coat. She had a flight to catch and a 7-year-old who expected her home. In the years that followed, and there would be many years and many things would follow, the galaxy's political analysts and historians and intelligence professionals would produce a vast literature attempting to characterize what humanity had done. They would argue about intent, about precedent, about the technical legality of everything that had occurred. They would debate the ethics of the infrastructure program, the strategic implications of the distributed network, the long-term consequences of the conclave's institutional failures. What they would never quite agree on, the thing that kept appearing at the end of papers and assessments and formal studies, usually in hedged, careful language, usually attributed to no single author, was the question of what precisely had made humanity so difficult to predict. The most comprehensive answer came not from a political analyst but from Hesse Dune, who spent 11 years after the events writing a book that was not about Earth specifically, but about the relationship between a civilization's willingness to accept short-term loss and its long-term viability, a book that began with a chapter on Earth and kept returning to it, because Earth kept demonstrating things she had not finished understanding. The book's most cited passage described a pattern she had identified not in Earth's economic data or its infrastructure programs, but in its historical record, a pattern that she argued was the actual source of everything the galaxy had failed to predict. She wrote, "Every dominant civilization in recorded history has interpreted human compliance as human defeat. Every dominant civilization in recorded history has discovered, eventually, that what they were observing was not defeat. The humans were not surrendering, they were waiting, not passively, never passively. They were working, building, learning the shape of the structure that held them so they could understand precisely and completely what would happen when it changed. They have a word in one of their older languages for this behavior. They call it resilience, though the word is insufficient. What they practice is something closer to deliberate persistence through apparent defeat, the willingness to accept loss in the present tense and continue operating toward a future that has not arrived yet. They are the only species we have documented that does not require its efforts to be immediately legible. They are comfortable doing things that look like nothing. They have learned from a history that would have broken most civilizations that the moment someone believes you have stopped mattering is precisely the moment to begin. The book was translated into 41 galactic languages. There was no official conclave response. But Veth Sarai, in the final pages of his memoir, written late in his life, in a tone stripped of all diplomatic architecture, recorded only one thing about the moment he had stood in the deliberative chamber and watched 3 empires show signs of collapse simultaneously, and felt the specific dread of a pattern recognized too late. He wrote that he had requested an immediate status report on Earth. He wrote that the report had come back clear. Earth was stable, compliant, unremarkable. He wrote that he had read the report and felt, briefly, relieved. And then he wrote, "I have thought about that feeling of relief many times since. It was the last moment I was certain I understood what was happening. I did not yet know that stable, compliant, unremarkable was exactly how it was supposed to look. I did not yet know that the woman who had smiled at our covenant and asked for 48 hours had already finished the calculation I was only beginning to run." The galaxy looked at humanity without its weapons and saw a species that had been made safe. What it had actually seen was a species that had decided, with characteristic patience, to become something that weapons cannot stop, necessary. And they had done it in the open, in plain sight, in full compliance with every clause of every covenant we had ever written, while we watched carefully for the wrong things, because we had decided we already knew what we were looking for. We never asked them why they were smiling. We should have asked. By the time we thought to ask, the answer was already infrastructure.